For decades, skeptics said King David was a myth, a Hebrew Hercules, a legend invented by later writers to give a small nation a glorious past. There was no inscription, no monument, no evidence outside the Bible that he ever existed. And then in 1993, an archaeologist in northern Israel brushed dirt off a broken stone and found 3 words that changed everything. In episode 1, we examined the manuscripts, 5,800 copies of the New Testament, closer to the originals than any other ancient text. The Dead Sea Scrolls bridging a 1,000-year gap with 95% accuracy. The text survived, but texts can describe imaginary worlds. There's only one way to check whether the Bible describes a real one. You dig. Biblical archaeology began as a discipline in the early 20th century, largely through the work of one man, William Foxwell Albright. Based at Johns Hopkins University, Albright spent decades excavating sites across the ancient Near East and comparing what he found with what the Bible described. His conclusion was striking. Discovery after discovery, he wrote, has established the accuracy of innumerable details and has brought increased recognition to the value of the Bible as a source of history. Albright's work launched an entire field. For decades, the assumption was that archaeology would continue to confirm the biblical narrative. It didn't always. By the 1990s, a group of scholars based primarily in Copenhagen and Tel Aviv began arguing that Albright had it backwards. The Bible, they claimed, was not a historical record confirmed by archaeology. It was a literary creation, written centuries after the events it describes, by authors who were constructing a national mythology, not recording history. Thomas Thompson called the Bible's Israel a literary fiction. Israel Finkelstein, one of the world's most cited archaeologists, argued that the biblical narratives of the patriarchs, the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, and the united monarchy of David and Solomon were largely composed in the 7th century BCE to serve the political agenda of King Josiah. The world in which the Bible was created, Finkelstein wrote, was not the world it describes. This is the minimalist-maximalist debate, and it has defined biblical archaeology for the last 30 years. On one side, scholars who argue the Bible preserves genuine historical memory. On the other, scholars who argue it's mostly fiction dressed as history. The evidence doesn't neatly favor either side, and that's what makes this interesting. Start with the texts themselves. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a rock into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard something shatter. What he found inside would become the most important manuscript discovery of the 20th century. The Dead Sea Scrolls, roughly 900 manuscripts, including fragments of nearly every book of the Old Testament, dating from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. The Great Isaiah Scroll, the most complete, dates to around 125 BCE. When scholars compared it to the medieval Masoretic text, copied roughly 1,000 years later, the two were 95% identical in substance. The remaining differences were overwhelmingly spelling variations. Not a single doctrine, not a single historical claim was affected. 1,000 years of hand copying, and the text held. Now to the ground. In 1993, archaeologist Avraham Buran was excavating the ancient gate complex at Tel Dan in northern Israel when his team uncovered a fragment of a basalt stone covered in Aramaic script. The inscription, dating to the 9th century BCE, recorded an Aramean king's boast of military victories. And in the text, 2 phrases, King of Israel and House of David. I knew at once that this was something extraordinary, Buran later recalled. The words House of David jumped out at me. It was the first reference to David's dynasty ever found outside the Bible. Before this discovery, the hard minimalists had argued that David was mythological, that there was no evidence he or his kingdom ever existed. Some skeptics initially challenged the reading, proposing that the letters didn't actually spell House of David. That challenge has not gained mainstream acceptance. The Tel Dan Stele didn't prove everything the Bible says about David. But it proved that his dynasty was real, recognized by neighboring states, and politically significant enough to be mentioned in a foreign king's victory monument, within roughly a century of David's reign. The New Testament has its own confirmations. In 1961, Italian archaeologists excavating the Roman theatre at Caesarea Maritima, the administrative capital of Roman Judea, found a reused limestone block bearing a Latin inscription. The surviving text reads, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. It's the only contemporary artifact mentioning Pilate by name. The Gospels call him governor, a general term. The inscription specifies his actual title, prefect. Interestingly, the Roman historian Tacitus, writing decades later, called Pilate a procurator, a different title. The inscription corrects Tacitus and aligns with the Gospel's more general usage. A small detail, but the kind of detail that matters when you're assessing whether a text was written by people who knew the world they were describing. Speaking of details, the Gospel of John describes 2 pools in Jerusalem with striking specificity. The pool of Bethesda near the sheep gate with 5 porticos, the pool of Siloam where Jesus heals a blind man. For centuries, skeptics argued that John's Gospel was a late theological text with no connection to Jerusalem's actual geography. Then archaeologists found both pools. The pool of Bethesda, a double pool with 5 covered colonnades, exactly as John described. And in 2004, during construction work south of the Temple Mount, archaeologists Ronnie Reich and Eli Shukron uncovered the stepped remains of a monumental pool from the Second Temple period, 225 feet long, matching the pool of Siloam. John didn't invent these places, he knew them. The pattern extends further. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in Babylon in 1879, records the Persian king Cyrus the Great's policy of returning displaced peoples to their homelands and restoring their temples, exactly the policy described in the Book of Ezra, where Cyrus decrees the return of the Jewish exiles. The Mesha stele, found in 1868, is a 9th century BCE inscription by King Mesha of Moab describing his rebellion against Israel, paralleling the account in 2 Kings. It mentions Omri, king of Israel by name. Hezekiah's tunnel, carved through solid rock beneath Jerusalem, matches the description in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, and the Siloam inscription found inside it, dating to around 701 BCE, describes the moment the 2 teams of tunnelers met in the middle. And the Ketef Hinnom silver scrolls, discovered in 1979 in a burial cave outside Jerusalem, contain the priestly blessing from the Book of Numbers, dating to the 7th century BCE, making them the oldest known fragment of biblical text, older than the Dead Sea Scrolls by 400 years. But here's where it gets complicated, because archaeology doesn't only confirm the Bible, sometimes it contradicts it. The most famous case, Jericho. The Book of Joshua describes the Israelites marching around the city, the walls collapsing and the city being destroyed. In the 1950s, British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon excavated Jericho with meticulous stratigraphic methods, far more rigorous than previous excavations. Her conclusion was devastating. "It is a sad fact," she wrote, "that of the town walls of the late Bronze Age, within which period the attack by the Israelites must fall by any dating, not a trace remains. No walls, no city, not during the period when the conquest supposedly happened. The destruction layer she found predated the biblical timeline by centuries." Bryant Wood challenged Kenyon's pottery dating in 1990, arguing the evidence is consistent with a conquest around 1400 BCE. His redating is disputed, but Kenyon's conclusion remains the majority position. The walls of Jericho, as described in Joshua, have not been found. Then there's the Exodus. 600,000 men, plus women and children, departing Egypt, wandering the Sinai for 40 years and conquering Canaan. It's the foundational narrative of the Hebrew Bible, and there is no archaeological evidence for it at the scale described. No trace of a massive Israelite presence in Egypt. No evidence of a large-scale departure. No remains of a 40-year encampment in the Sinai, a desert that preserves archaeological traces remarkably well. Egyptian records from the relevant periods are extensive and mention no such event. Finkelstein puts it bluntly, the Exodus as described in the Bible did not happen. Some scholars, like Kenneth Kitchen, argue for a smaller-scale exodus, perhaps a few thousand people rather than millions, that would leave little archaeological trace. Others point to the Merneptah stele, an Egyptian victory inscription dating to around 1208 BCE, which contains the earliest known reference to Israel outside the Bible. The pharaoh boasts, "Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more." The boast was premature, but the inscription confirms that an entity called Israel existed in Canaan by the late 13th century BCE. Something brought them there. But what that something was, and whether it resembles the biblical account, remains an open question. Even the united monarchy is contested. The Bible describes Solomon as ruling a vast, wealthy kingdom with monumental building projects at Hazor, Megiddo, and Jezer. For decades, archaeologists attributed impressive gate structures at these sites to Solomon. Then Finkelstein proposed his low chronology, arguing that these structures actually date to the Omride dynasty of the 9th century BCE, a full century later. If he's right, Solomon's kingdom shrinks from a regional power to a modest highland chieftaincy. Amihai Mazar, one of Israel's most respected archaeologists, pushes back. The archaeological evidence, he argues, does not support the minimalist view that David and Solomon were insignificant chieftains, but neither does it confirm the biblical picture of a vast empire. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in the middle. And the debate hinges on roughly 50 to 80 years of pottery dating, a narrow technical margin with enormous historical consequences. So where does this leave us? Archaeology has confirmed that the Bible describes a real world. Real people: Pilate, David's dynasty, Omri, Mesha, Cyrus. Real places: the pool of Siloam, Hezekiah's tunnel, the gates of ancient cities. Real events: the Moab-Israel conflict, the Babylonian exile, the Persian return of exiles. The Dead Sea Scrolls have demonstrated that the Old Testament was transmitted with extraordinary fidelity across a millennium. These are not trivial confirmations. They demonstrate that the biblical authors were writing about a world they knew, not inventing one from scratch. But archaeology has also challenged major biblical narratives. The conquest of Jericho as described in Joshua has not been confirmed. The Exodus at the scale described lacks archaeological support. The grandeur of Solomon's kingdom is disputed, and archaeology cannot by its nature confirm miracles, theological claims, or divine inspiration. Finding the pool of Siloam confirms that John knew Jerusalem's geography. It does not confirm that a miracle occurred there. The distinction matters. Perhaps the most honest assessment comes from William Dever, a self-described secular humanist with no religious agenda. The Bible is not a history book in the modern sense, he writes, but it does contain genuine historical memory. The minimalists are wrong to dismiss it, and the fundamentalists are wrong to treat it as a textbook. Dever is not a believer. He has no theological stake in the Bible's reliability. But after decades of excavation, his conclusion is clear. The archaeological evidence confirms far more of the Bible's historical world than the minimalists expected, and far less than the maximalists hoped. That's the honest position. The Bible is not a fairy tale. It describes real people, real places, and real events that archaeology has independently confirmed. But it's also not a modern history textbook. It contains narratives that archaeology challenges, events it cannot verify, and claims that lie beyond the reach of any spade. The ground tells us that the biblical world was real. It doesn't tell us that everything described in that world happened exactly as written. And it certainly doesn't tell us whether the God described in those texts exists. That's a different kind of question, one that archaeology was never designed to answer. The text survived. The ground confirms key details. But who wrote these texts, and were they there when the events happened? In the next episode, we'll examine the eyewitness question. Who wrote the Gospels? Were they based on first-hand testimony, or are they legends that grew over time? The investigation continues. The Bible describes a world. Archaeology has dug it up. Some of what it found matches, some of it doesn't. And some questions remain unanswered, buried under centuries of dirt, waiting for the next archaeologist to brush them clean. The ground has spoken, but it hasn't said everything.